You're taught that Japan attacked Pearl Harbor because of militaristic aggression and dreams of Pacific domination, but that's far from the truth. There are actually 7 key reasons that pushed Japan toward war. By December 1941, Japan had been expanding for 10 years. During those years, the empire had seized Manchuria, invaded China, and moved into Indochina without triggering a major war with Western powers. Economic pressure increased, but diplomatic maneuvering had kept the conflict limited. The pattern seemed sustainable, and the strategy appeared to be working. Suddenly, on December 7, 1941, Japan abandoned this cautious approach. Japanese aircraft descended on Pearl Harbor in waves, sinking or damaging 8 battleships and killing 2,403 Americans. Japan gambled everything on military conflict when diplomatic options still existed. What follows is the story of how those 7 reasons built, converged, and finally exploded into the Pacific War that would claim over 20 million lives. Section 1. China War Trap. Japan didn't strike Pearl Harbor from a position of confidence. The nation struck from fear of losing everything it had fought for over 10 years, and that fight began far from Hawaii in Manchuria. In September 1931, Japanese military officers fabricated an explosion on a railway near Mukden, then blamed Chinese forces. This became the pretext for seizing all of Manchuria. In her book Japan 1941, Countdown to Infamy, historian Hotta documented how the Kwantung Army moved quickly, establishing control within months. By early 1932, Japan had created Manchukuo, a puppet government that gave Tokyo access to coal, iron, and agricultural resources. When the League of Nations condemned the invasion, Japan responded by withdrawing from the League in 1933, which began its diplomatic isolation from the West. However, the conquest appeared successful, as the army had gained territory and resources with minimal cost. This success encouraged further expansion. Military leaders pushed for more territorial gains. In July 1937, a clash between Japanese and Chinese troops near the Marco Polo Bridge outside Beijing escalated into full-scale war, which led Prime Minister Prince Konoye to order massive reinforcements to China rather than containing the incident. By ordering reinforcements instead of seeking de-escalation, Japan crossed the Rubicon. In the months that followed, Japanese forces captured Shanghai after brutal fighting. In December 1937, they seized Nanjing, the Chinese capital. What happened next destroyed Japan's international reputation and hardened Western opposition to Japanese expansion. What followed in Nanjing became one of the war's worst atrocities. Japanese soldiers roamed Nanjing for weeks, engaging in systematic violence against civilians and prisoners. In his book, The Rising Sun, The Decline and Fall of the Japanese Empire, 1936 to 1945, historian John Toland documented that General Matsui had ordered troops to exhibit honor and protect Chinese civilians. Instead, Toland noted, soldiers hunted men, women, and children like rabbits, while Western journalists and missionaries witnessed the atrocities and reported them to the world. Estimates of Chinese civilians and prisoners killed range from tens of thousands to over 200,000, according to multiple historical accounts. However, the strategic failure ran deeper than moral condemnation. Despite the brutality, China didn't surrender. The war that Japanese planners thought would end in months dragged on for years. Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist forces retreated deeper into China's interior and continued resistance from Chongqing, while Chinese communist forces waged effective guerrilla warfare from northern strongholds. As Hotta noted, Japan controlled the cities and railways, but could not pacify the vast countryside, where Chinese resistance remained strong. By 1940, the empire's overextension became clear. The empire occupied Korea, Manchuria, and much of coastal China, and had moved forces into northern French Indochina in September of that year. Each expansion required more troops, more supplies, and more resources, which meant production couldn't match the growing demands. By 1941, Japan had over 1 million troops deployed across China, Korea, and Manchuria. The war consumed enormous resources without achieving its objectives. As Hotta described it, the war became a whirlpool, sucking down thousands of young men, tons of military equipment, and millions of yen. The overextension created impossible strain. Japan's industrial capacity couldn't match the demands, steel production fell short, fuel reserves dropped, and supply lines stretched thousands of miles through hostile territory, constantly threatened by Chinese guerrilla attacks. Historians debate what trapped Japan in the China War. Some scholars, like Hotta, emphasize that institutional rivalry between the Army and the Navy prevented either service from accepting withdrawal. Others contend that the sunk cost fallacy made retreat politically impossible after investing so much blood and treasure. From either perspective, Japan faced three options by 1941, and all were terrible. The first option meant withdrawing from China, abandoning 4 years of fighting and hundreds of thousands of casualties, and admitting the entire enterprise had been a mistake. Japan's military culture made this politically impossible, as officers who suggested withdrawal risked violence from ultranationalist fanatics. Prince Konoe, who had started the war, lacked the courage to end it, which meant the military had invested too much blood and prestige to accept humiliation. The second option meant continuing the China War indefinitely, hoping for eventual victory. Japan's economy couldn't sustain this, as the expanding empire required more troops, more supplies, and more resources than production could provide. This left option 3, expand south to seize the resources needed to sustain the war in China. The Dutch East Indies possessed oil fields. Meanwhile, British Malaya produced rubber and tin, while French Indochina offered rice and a strategic position. Together, these territories could provide what Japan's economy desperately needed. However, seizing them meant war with the Western colonial powers, especially the United States, which was allied with Britain and had economic interests throughout Southeast Asia. The U.S. Pacific Fleet, based at Pearl Harbor, stood as the main obstacle to southern expansion. As a result, Japan faced terrible logic. The empire couldn't withdraw from China without political collapse. At the same time, continuing the China War required more resources. Yet seizing those resources meant confronting America, which in turn required neutralizing the Pacific Fleet based at Pearl Harbor. In this way, the China quagmire created direct pressure for the attack, but it took another American action to transform pressure into crisis, an oil embargo that created a countdown clock Japan could not ignore. Section 2. The Oil Crisis. Throughout 1940 and early 1941, American economic pressure on Japan increased gradually. The Roosevelt administration restricted exports of aviation fuel and scrap metal. These were limited measures, designed to signal American disapproval of Japanese expansion while preserving room for diplomacy. Regardless, Japan continued its territorial expansion. In July 1941, Japanese forces moved into southern French Indochina, positioning themselves near British Malaya and the Dutch East Indies. This was a clear preparation for further conquest, which led President Roosevelt to respond with the harshest economic measures short of war. On July 26, 1941, Roosevelt froze all Japanese assets in the United States, ending U.S.-Japan trade overnight. Days later, Roosevelt imposed a total oil embargo, while Britain and the Dutch government in exile joined the blockade, cutting off Japan's access to oil from the Dutch East Indies. In his book Bankrupting the Enemy, the U.S. financial siege of Japan before Pearl Harbor, historian Edward Miller documented that Japan lost nearly 90% of its oil supply in 1 month. This wasn't a limited trade restriction, but a complete shutdown. Japan's entire economy depended on imported oil, which meant the Navy required fuel for its ships, the Army needed fuel for trucks and aircraft, and industry needed oil for production. Without imports, the whole structure would collapse. Naval planners calculated they had approximately 18 months of fuel reserves at current consumption rates, according to Miller's analysis of Japanese planning documents. After that, the fleet couldn't operate, merchant shipping would stop, and armies in China, Manchuria, and Southeast Asia would be stranded without supplies. The oil cutoff created a ticking clock counting down to total strategic failure. As a result, Japan's strategic options transformed into an immediate crisis. Before July 1941, leaders could deliberate about long-term policy. After the restrictions took effect, they faced a deadline, which meant they had to do something within 18 months or watch the empire collapse without fighting. These economic measures presented three options, each worse than the last. The first option meant negotiating with the United States to restore trade. American demands were clear as Secretary of State Cordell Hull insisted Japan withdraw from China and Indochina and abandon the tripartite pact with Germany and Italy. In exchange, America would restore oil shipments. To Japanese military leaders, this was a complete surrender. It meant abandoning everything gained since the Manchurian invasion of 1931, accepting Western dominance in Asia, and facing national humiliation that would likely trigger a military coup against any government that accepted such terms. The second option meant accepting fuel depletion and slow-motion defeat. As oil ran out, naval operations would cease. The merchant fleet would stop running, and armies in China and Manchuria would be isolated. Occupation forces in Korea and Taiwan would lack support, which meant the empire would unravel without America firing a shot. This violated everything Japan's military culture valued. To military officers trained in the offensive spirit of Bushido, accepting defeat without fighting was worse than death. The third option meant seizing the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies by force. Indonesia had the oil Japan needed, and British Malaya had rubber and tin. These territories could theoretically sustain the empire if Japan controlled them. However, this meant war with Britain, the Netherlands, and almost certainly the United States. As long as the U.S. Pacific Fleet sat at Pearl Harbor, it could threaten Japanese shipping lanes and block the southern advance. Throughout fall 1941, Ambassador Kichizaburo Nomura met repeatedly with Secretary Hull in Washington, seeking a diplomatic solution. The negotiations were genuine on both sides, but the gap was unbridgeable. America wouldn't restore oil shipments without Japan withdrawing from China, while Japan wouldn't withdraw from China after 4 years of war and hundreds of thousands of casualties. Each side waited for the other to compromise on the basic issue, and neither could. By November 1941, Japan's leaders concluded negotiation wouldn't work. The oil was depleting month by month, and every week of delay meant less fuel for the conflict they believed was coming. The deadline effect took hold. Before the blockade, there had been time to consider options carefully. After the blockade took effect, military planners controlled the agenda. Only they offered a solution that avoided slow collapse. Strike first, strike hard, seize the resources by force, then defend the new perimeter until America negotiated peace. In this way, the oil crisis handed control to military hardliners. As a result, the question became not whether Japan would fight, but when. Yet even facing fuel depletion and economic collapse, some Japanese leaders wanted peace. The answer to why they couldn't stop the march to war lay in a military culture that made negotiation politically impossible. Section 3. No diplomatic option. Japan's military drew its identity from Bushido traditions, emphasizing honor, loyalty, and victory over survival. During the late 19th and early 20th centuries, these warrior codes were modernized and intensified as Japan built a modern military. The officer corps absorbed a clear message: negotiation under pressure equals surrender, and surrender equals dishonor worse than death. This wasn't just rhetoric, but systematic indoctrination taught in military academies and reinforced throughout officers' careers, which meant bold offense was celebrated, while caution and defensive thinking were viewed as weakness. This created a strong bias toward aggressive solutions, even when such solutions defied logic. The military's political power reinforced this culture. Under the Meiji Constitution, the Army and Navy could advise the emperor directly, independent of the civilian government. In her book, Japan 1941, Countdown to Infamy, Historian Hotta documented that this independence of the Supreme Command meant Japan could have two governments with completely contradictory foreign policies, one civilian and one military, with no mechanism to resolve the contradiction. Throughout the 1930s, the military's power grew through intimidation and violence. In May 1932, young naval officers killed Prime Minister Tsuyoshi Inukai, who had advocated a diplomatic approach to the Manchurian situation. 4 years later, in February 1936, young army officers attempted a coup, killing the finance minister, the Lord Keeper of the Privy Seal, and the Inspector General of Military Education. They surrounded the imperial palace, planning to install a military government. Emperor Hirohito personally intervened to crush the coup, and the rebel leaders were executed. However, the incident terrorized moderate politicians and officers, which sent a clear message. Advocating compromise with the West could get you killed. After 1936, those ultranationalist terrorists never succeeded in taking over Japan. However, they did succeed in creating a fearful atmosphere that silenced moderate leadership by 1941, as Hotta noted. No one wanted to be the next moderate politician shot by fanatics. The Army-Navy rivalry made the problem worse. The two services competed ruthlessly for resources, prestige, and strategic control. The Army focused on continental Asia, including China and potential conflict with the Soviet Union, while the Navy focused on the Pacific and Southern expansion for resources. There was no unified command structure, as the emperor theoretically served as supreme commander, but Hirohito rarely imposed his will to unify the services. This meant competing strategies pushed both services toward escalation to prove their approach was correct. Neither service could appear weak or willing to back down without losing internal political battles. If the Navy advocated caution, the Army could claim the Navy lacked fighting spirit, while if the Army suggested negotiation, the Navy could accuse them of cowardice. This rivalry made negotiation politically impossible within the military establishment itself. The rise of General Hideki Tojo symbolized the hardliners' triumph. Tojo had commanded the Kwantung Army in Manchuria, representing the officers who had built careers over the decade of expansion. When he became prime minister on October 18, 1941, moderates knew their cause was lost. Tojo represented officers for whom withdrawal from China meant admitting the entire decade of expansion had been a mistake. Their prestige, their careers, and their worldview depended on expansion continuing, which meant that for them, negotiation meant professional and political suicide. Yet, strangely, even Tojo harbored private doubts. Hotta documented that he was acutely aware of the small possibility of Japanese victory. When he became prime minister, the first task he set himself was attempting to resurrect diplomatic options with the United States. However, Tojo couldn't confront the military institution he represented. He presided over a system where no individual controlled policy, where collective decision-making meant no one took responsibility, and where Japanese culture's preference for consensus made honest discussion about the country's future nearly impossible. Cultural factors deepened the divide. To Japanese leaders, negotiation from weakness equaled surrender. To American and European diplomats, negotiation was normal statecraft, which meant the cultural gap made compromise impossible. The U.S. saw the oil embargo as legitimate diplomatic pressure responding to Japanese aggression, while Japan saw it as economic warfare requiring military response. Different cultural frameworks led to different conclusions about what constituted an honorable response. As a result, military culture valued offense over caution, while assassinations had silenced moderate voices. At the same time, internal service rivalry prevented either the Army or Navy from backing down. Tojo's rise represented the hardline faction's victory, which meant cultural assumptions made negotiation politically impossible. Yet culture alone didn't doom Japan. Leaders also severely misread American psychology and industrial power, leading to miscalculations that sealed Japan's defeat. Section 4. Misreading America. Japanese military planners studied American society carefully. They examined industrial statistics, political debates, and public opinion. From this research, they drew conclusions that proved completely wrong. They saw isolationism and anti-war sentiment dividing American politics, including the America First movement led by Charles Lindbergh, which commanded massive public support against entering foreign wars. At the same time, fierce congressional debates over aid to Britain suggested Americans were deeply divided. From these observations, planners concluded Americans were soft and unwilling to fight a prolonged war in the distant Pacific. Racial stereotypes reinforced this belief, which meant Japanese propaganda portrayed Americans as focused on material comfort and lacking the collective warrior spirit of Japan. Democracy, in this view, meant indecision and lack of will. This misreading shaped Japan's entire strategy. Japanese military doctrine emphasized the decisive battle, which they called Kantai Kessen, meaning one major engagement that would decide the war's outcome. One major victory could force the enemy to negotiate peace, and Japan believed historical experience supported this theory. However, this belief rested on a flawed comparison. Japan's earlier victory against Russia had created false confidence that would prove disastrous. Japanese intelligence knew the industrial statistics, which showed America produced 5 times Japan's steel output and had 7 times Japan's oil production. American shipbuilding capacity vastly exceeded Japan's, and the numbers were undeniable. However, planners convinced themselves that the numbers didn't matter. They believed fighting spirit would overcome material disadvantage, while they assumed the war would be short, decided by initial battles before American industry could fully mobilize. They didn't account for America's ability to turn peacetime factories into war production almost overnight. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who planned the Pearl Harbor attack, understood the danger. He had studied at Harvard and served as naval attaché in Washington, and he warned his colleagues repeatedly that Japan couldn't win a long war with America. In his book At Dawn We Slept, The Untold Story of Pearl Harbor, historian Gordon Prange documented Yamamoto's famous statement. He could run wild for 6 months to a year, he said, but after that, he had no confidence in victory. This meant he understood the industrial gap meant Japan couldn't sustain prolonged conflict with America. However, Yamamoto's warnings were ignored by Army hardliners, who dismissed them as defeatism. The Navy went along with war planning because refusing would mean losing internal political battles with the Army, which meant the officer who planned Pearl Harbor knew Japan couldn't win, yet the military culture and political dynamics pushed Japan toward war anyway. Japanese intelligence made another critical error by misreading American political intentions. Planners assumed economic pressure was merely a bluff, believing Roosevelt faced too much domestic opposition to actually fight a war in Asia. This led them to expect isolationist sentiment would prevent American mobilization, which meant they completely missed how the Pearl Harbor attack itself would transform American public opinion. On December 8, 1941, President Roosevelt asked Congress to declare war. The vote was 388-1 in the House and 82-0 in the Senate, with 1 abstention. Only Representative Jeanette Rankin, a pacifist from Montana, voted no. The America First Committee disbanded within days, and isolationism evaporated overnight. The attack that was supposed to force America into negotiation instead united the country for total war. Cultural assumptions prevented accurate threat assessment. Japanese officers believed in Yamato's racial superiority, that the Japanese descended from gods and possessed unique fighting spirit. This fed overconfidence and contempt for enemies. Americans held their own flawed views. Many believed Asians were inferior, that the Japanese were mere imitators who couldn't match Western innovation or fighting skill. These assumptions turned out to be wrong when American forces, unprepared for the quality of Japanese aircraft and pilot training, suffered losses in early encounters. However, American underestimation of Japanese capabilities proved less dangerous than Japanese assumptions that Americans would quit after early defeats. This was backward, as Americans responded to the attack with fury and determination that wouldn't accept anything less than total victory. Early Japanese victories created what historians later called victory disease. Each quick success reinforced belief in Japanese superiority. Officers who had won easily believed the pattern would continue, which meant this overconfidence from past victories became confirmation bias. Leaders sought evidence supporting their expectations and dismissed contrary evidence as Western propaganda. When Prince Konoe heard about the Pearl Harbor attack, according to Hotta, he privately feared a terrible defeat was coming. He believed Japan's favorable situation would only last 2 or 3 months. His foresight was rare among Japanese leaders. As most expected, early victories would force American negotiations before the industrial giant fully awakened. As a result, they severely misread the American will to fight. They believed one major blow would force peace, while they underestimated industrial power and ignored warnings from their own experts. Overconfidence from early victories prevented an accurate assessment of the forces they were about to unleash. These miscalculations were made worse by Japan's focus on the wrong naval weapons and doctrine, a mistake that would cost them dearly within 6 months. Section 5. Outdated Doctrine. Before World War II, battleships represented the ultimate naval weapon worldwide. These massive warships carried the biggest guns and the thickest armor, which made them symbols of national sea power. Japan built the Yamato and Musashi, the largest battleships ever constructed, as Yamato displaced 70,000 tons and mounted 18-inch guns. These ships represented an enormous investment of scarce resources. Alfred Thayer Mahan's doctrines had dominated naval thinking for 50 years. In his book Pacific Crucible, War at Sea in the Pacific, 1941 to 1942, historian Ian Toll documented that Mahan preached 3 core principles. Concentrate your fleet as a single unit, build the biggest battleships with the biggest guns, and seek a decisive battle to destroy the enemy's fleet. Mahan's influence was particularly strong in Japan. Toll noted that more of his works were translated into Japanese than any other language, which meant both the Navy and Army staff colleges adopted his writings as textbooks. Admiral Heihachiro Togo, the victor at Tsushima, praised Mahan's work as the highest authority in military science. Mahan's decisive battle doctrine fits with Japanese culture. Toll observed that it matched the samurai philosopher Miyamoto Musashi's teaching about total focus on a single decisive blow, which helps explain why Japan sought a knockout punch at Pearl Harbor. However, by 1941, Mahan's doctrines were rapidly becoming outdated. Aircraft carriers were emerging as the primary naval weapon. Carrier-based aircraft could strike targets hundreds of miles away, while battleships, for all their impressive guns and armor, could only fight what they could see from their decks. As Toll noted, a few officers guessed that airplanes and submarines would rewrite all the rules of naval warfare, and that battleships would become worse than useless because of the money and manpower they consumed. Despite this outdated thinking, the attack itself revealed the contradiction. Japan used carriers to attack, as Japanese carrier aircraft flew from 6 carriers to strike the U.S. Pacific Fleet. The attack effectively demonstrated carrier aviation's power, with dive bombers and torpedo planes coordinated by 0 fighters. American witnesses were surprised by Japanese capability. Americans had believed Japanese naval air power was weak, an assortment of second-rate airplanes piloted by third-rate aviators. Toll documented that this assumption collapsed as Americans watched Japanese pilots flying low and executing coordinated attacks. However, despite using carriers effectively, Japanese strategic thinking remained locked in battleship-focused planning. The target priority at Pearl Harbor was battleships. Along Battleship Row, 8 battleships were sunk or damaged. The California was half-sunk, West Virginia was smashed and blazing, and Oklahoma had capsized with her keel pointing toward the sky. According to Toll, Arizona's forward magazine detonated in a mighty explosion, sending a fireball thousands of feet into the air, which meant more than 1,000 of Arizona's crew died instantly. By 8:10 in the morning, Just 15 minutes after the first bombs struck, the main battle force of the Pacific Fleet was crippled. The attack succeeded in its immediate tactical objective. However, Japan targeted the past of naval warfare, not the future. The strike missed critical targets that would have crippled Pearl Harbor for far longer. Oil storage tanks contained millions of barrels of fuel, which meant destroying them would have shut down the base for months or years. Dry docks and repair facilities were left untouched, and destroying these would have forced the Navy to send damaged ships back to the West Coast for repairs, removing them from the war for extended periods. Beyond the base infrastructure, the submarine base was also ignored. American submarines would go on to devastate Japan's merchant fleet and strangle the empire's supply lines, which meant hitting the submarine base would have delayed this critical campaign. Most critically, the attack missed all three American aircraft carriers. Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga were not in port on December 7th. Enterprise was delayed returning from Wake Island, missing the attack by hours, while Lexington was ferrying aircraft to Midway, and Saratoga was in San Diego for maintenance. These carriers would become the core of America's Pacific striking force. They would fight at Coral Sea in May 1942 and Midway in June 1942, reversing Japan's early conquests. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, who commanded the strike force, worried about American counterattack. He feared losing carriers and withdrew after 2 strikes rather than launching a third wave against Pearl Harbor's infrastructure, which meant this caution reflected doctrine that still viewed carriers as supporting weapons rather than primary striking arms. Despite having effective carrier aircraft and strong tactical capabilities, Japan's strategic thinking remained focused on battleships. The Zero fighter outperformed American fighters in 1941, and Japanese naval aviation had developed considerable skill. Yet planners still viewed carriers as scouts and support rather than the main striking force, which meant they hadn't caught up to their own tactical capabilities. In contrast, American naval doctrine evolved faster. By 1942, American admirals understood carriers were now supreme, and when battleships were sunk at Pearl Harbor, the Navy was forced to build a strategy around carriers. This forced adaptation turned out to work in America's favor. As a result, Japan destroyed the weapons that were already becoming outdated and missed the weapons that would defeat the empire. Japan used the future of naval warfare to attack the past of naval warfare. Within 6 months, this error would cost them at Midway. However, the mistakes went deeper than doctrine. Intelligence failures on both sides turned Pearl Harbor into a surprise that should have been predicted. Section 6. Intelligence failures. Intelligence failure at Pearl Harbor ran both directions. Japan missed critical information, America missed crucial warnings, and both sides had pieces of the puzzle, yet neither assembled them correctly. Japanese intelligence knew Pearl Harbor's routines. Spies and observers had provided detailed information about ship schedules, defensive measures, and base activities, which meant they knew when battleships typically returned to port on weekends and understood patrol patterns and radar coverage. However, Japanese intelligence had critical gaps. They didn't know American carrier schedules with certainty. The location of Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga on December 7th was unknown to Japanese planners until after the strike, which meant missing all 3 carriers was the single biggest tactical failure at Pearl Harbor, directly resulting from this intelligence gap. Japanese planners also underestimated American code-breaking progress. They didn't know the United States had broken their highest-level diplomatic code, called Purple, and through magic intercepts, Washington was reading messages between Tokyo and Japanese embassies worldwide. American intelligence failures were equally significant. The United States knew war was coming. Magic intercepts showed negotiations failing, and Tokyo preparing for military action, which meant American leaders expected Japanese strikes somewhere in the Pacific within days or weeks. However, they expected the wrong target, as the Philippines seemed the obvious choice, perhaps British Malaya or the Dutch East Indies. Hawaii, defended by the Pacific Fleet itself, seemed too bold a target. This assumption that Japan wouldn't be daring enough to strike Pearl Harbor turned out to be completely wrong. Communication failures made the problem worse, as Washington knew more than Hawaii. Magic intercepts gave the Roosevelt administration a clear picture of worsening relations. However, this extremely sensitive intelligence was kept secret from most commanders. In his book, At Dawn We Slept, The Untold Story of Pearl Harbor, historian Gordon Prange documented that Admiral Husband Kimmel at Pearl Harbor and General Walter Short, the Army commander, were not fully briefed on magic. Prange documented that the decision to withhold magic from field commanders came from security concerns. The fewer people who knew about this intelligence breakthrough, the less likely Japan would discover it. However, keeping this intelligence secret meant Kimmel and Short lacked crucial context to interpret the warnings they did receive. In late November 1941, Washington sent war warnings to both commanders. The November 27th message stated clearly that negotiations with Japan had ceased and an aggressive move by Japan was expected within the next few days. However, the warning specified expected strike locations, including the Philippines, Tai or Kra Peninsula, or possibly Borneo, which meant Hawaii was not on the list. On December 6th and early December 7th, Magic intercepted Japan's 14-part message breaking off negotiations. Army intelligence officer Colonel Rufus Bratton recognized that a follow-up message ordering the Japanese embassy to deliver the note at exactly 1 p.m. Washington time meant something would happen at that hour, but the message didn't say where. Even with this intelligence, no one imagined Pearl Harbor was the target. The radar detection on the morning of December 7th showed how intelligence failures worked. At 7:02 a.m., two Army radar operators at Opana Point detected a large flight of aircraft 132 miles north of Oahu. Private Joseph Lockard called the information center, and Lieutenant Kermit Tyler, a fighter pilot filling in as duty officer, told them not to worry. Tyler assumed the radar contacts were B-17 bombers expected from the mainland. This assumption was partially correct, as B-17s were arriving from California, but from a different direction. The radar had actually detected the first wave of Japanese aircraft, showing how the right information led to the wrong conclusion. After the strike began, intelligence confusion multiplied. In his book, Pacific Crucible, War at Sea in the Pacific, 1941 to 1942, historian Ian Toll documented that Kimmel's headquarters was overwhelmed by reports that were unclear, contradictory, or altogether wrong. Early reports suggested enemy carriers both north and south of Oahu, while a transmission error from the cruiser Minneapolis made a message reading no enemy carriers appear as two enemy carriers. Both sides suffered from seeing what they expected to see. Japanese planners expected Americans to be unprepared and focused on the Philippines, while American commanders expected Japanese behavior that wouldn't include striking Pearl Harbor. Cultural assumptions prevented accurate threat assessment on both sides. The Japanese couldn't imagine Americans fighting with determination after early defeats, while the Americans couldn't imagine the Japanese being bold enough to strike Hawaii. The myth that America was sleeping is too simple. America wasn't sleeping, but was looking in the wrong direction. Washington knew war was coming and sent warnings, yet the warnings pointed to the wrong targets based on assumptions that turned out to be incorrect. As a result, Japan's intelligence also failed by missing the carrier locations, underestimating American code-breaking, and not understanding how the strike would unite American public opinion. Intelligence failures on both sides turned Pearl Harbor into a surprise that should have been predicted. These failures set the stage for immediate consequences that would reverse the war's momentum within 6 months. Section 7. The Midway Disaster. The Pearl Harbor strike succeeded tactically. 8 battleships were sunk or damaged, 2,400 Americans were killed, and 188 aircraft were destroyed, while Japanese losses were minimal, 29 aircraft and 5 midget submarines. By any tactical measure, the operation was a victory. However, tactical success masked strategic disaster. The strike didn't destroy fuel depots that contained millions of barrels of oil. It didn't wreck repair facilities that could fix damaged ships. It didn't hit the submarine base. And most critically, it missed all 3 American carriers, which meant Pearl Harbor united American public opinion instantly. It gave Roosevelt the political support for war he couldn't have achieved through diplomacy, ended isolationism overnight, and led Congress to declare war with just 1 dissenting vote. The first sign of strategic failure came just 4 months later, on April 18, 1942. Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle led 16 B-25 bombers launched from the carrier Hornet. They bombed Tokyo and several other Japanese cities before most crews crash-landed in China or ditched at sea. Physical damage was minimal, yet the mental impact was serious, as Japanese military and government leaders had promised the homeland was protected and the emperor's safety was guaranteed. American bombers reaching Tokyo shattered these promises. Military prestige collapsed while public confidence wavered. The Doolittle raid forced a Japanese response, which meant the Navy demanded action to prevent future strikes. They needed to expand the defensive line and draw out American carriers for the decisive battle they had sought since Pearl Harbor. Midway Island became the target. Located 1,300 miles northwest of Hawaii, Midway would threaten Hawaii if Japan controlled it, and an attack on Midway would surely force the American carriers to respond. Japan could then destroy them in the decisive battleship carrier engagement that would win the Pacific War. However, the plan was rushed. Forces were divided, and Japan faced an enemy with a decisive advantage. American codebreakers had broken Japan's naval code JN-25. They knew Japanese plans, timing, and forces, which meant Admiral Chester Nimitz, now commanding the Pacific Fleet, set an ambush. On June 4, 1942, the Battle of Midway began. In his book Miracle at Midway, historian Gordon Prange documented that in one day Japan lost 4 fleet carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. All 4 had participated in the Pearl Harbor strike, and their loss crippled Japanese offensive capacity. Japan also lost many elite pilots. Unlike aircraft, which factories could replace in months, pilots required years of training, which meant the lost experience was irreplaceable. America lost the carrier Yorktown, damaged at Coral Sea a month earlier but rushed back to service. 1 American carrier versus 4 Japanese carriers meant the naval balance shifted permanently. Admiral Yamamoto had predicted he could run wild for 6 months to a year. Midway came exactly 6 months after Pearl Harbor, and his prediction turned out to be accurate. Every tactical error at Pearl Harbor contributed to the strategic defeat at Midway. Japan's focus on battleships meant missing the carriers that mattered. Failing to destroy infrastructure meant America could repair and rebuild quickly. Uniting American resolve meant facing total industrial mobilization, and underestimating American determination meant being surprised when the U.S. fought back with fury rather than seeking peace. And American code-breaking, which Japanese intelligence had underestimated, gave Nimitz the decisive advantage at Midway. After Midway, Japan was forced into defensive war, the kind of war Japan couldn't win. This meant a grinding war of wearing down an enemy with vastly superior industrial capacity and growing technological advantages. Most importantly, Japan lost the strategic initiative. Pearl Harbor's tactical success led directly to Midway's strategic disaster. A strike that was supposed to force America into peace instead awakened industrial power that would systematically destroy Japan's empire. Understanding why this happened requires seeing how all 7 reasons worked together. Over 20 million people died in the Pacific War over the next 4 years. The strategic outcome was total defeat. Pearl Harbor failed to achieve any of its objectives. The strike didn't destroy American carriers, didn't force negotiation, and instead united American public opinion for total war. Japan's decision was based on false assumptions about American resolve, the importance of carriers over battleships, and the power of American industry. The strike that was supposed to end the war quickly instead guaranteed a long war Japan couldn't win. Within 6 months at Midway, the consequences became clear, but the collapse happened faster than anyone expected. To see how the Battle of Midway destroyed Japan's offensive power in hours, watch this video next.